All right, just beginning.
Still no share.
Say what? I know,
Yeah,
not yet.
Okay.
Now it
Okay.
is. Now it is. Just give me a second.
There we go. There.
Hote. Hello, everyone. Um, Let me straighten a few things out here. I think we're set to go. Welcome to Dis and Dat 24 October in about 48 minutes. I have to get off for Adnan Hussein's office hour. Uh, and he's going to talk to a very interesting person, Jason W. Moore, who's I think at Binghamton. And he has a very interesting point of view, which is worth discussing. Problematic in the sense that, he always defaults to the web of life, which I always find problematic. But anyway, that's me. Fortunately, we'll probably end exactly on time. But if I can find my place here, come on, 1.3, come on. We were talking yesterday about living labor, etc., the relationship amongst these things, and showing how labor still is the key for how circulation operates, and that subsumption could not take place unless there were living people engaged in the process, because ultimately it has to come back to the market of commodities, all those commodity things. So there's that. So 1.4, the two component parts of capital, MECW 30, pages 105 to 35. In the Grundrisse, Marx had discovered the question of the component parts, the Bestandteil of capital, very slowly, with frequent comings and goings in the logic of discovery. Now we will see only a few developments of the logic of presentation. Thus, there will still be advances later in Capital, the book, because the problem has not yet been definitely resolved. More specifically, Marx approaches the question of the money, that is M1, recall the diagram above, which is promised in the purchase of the labor capacity, where C1 is the worker as subject S2. So let me break here for a moment and say, recall that it is like, with all due respect to volume 2 of Capital, it's moving down within the context of Department 1, Department 2. So it is, moving forward. There's a kind of weird circulatory thing that kind of it's kind of a feedback loop, as it were. Back to the text. At this point, he mentions little or nothing about the means of production and never speaks about variable capital. He discusses it in its content, but has not named it. Quote, the social mode of production in which the production process is subsumed under capital, or which rests on the relation of capital and wage labor, and indeed in such a way that it is the determining dominant mode of production. We call all of this mess capitalist production. Close quote. For those who are habituated to the discourse and language of the later Marx, all these expressions seem, obvious. But in an accurate reading of these manuscripts, that is 61 to 63, there is, however, a conceptual, categorical, and even denominational innovation. In effect, what Marx is interested in these pages is to clarify the function of this portion of capital expended in wages, namely the relation of purchase, that is M1 C1 of figure 1.1. Marx makes the problem somewhat more complex when he raises a second question: to what extent is each of these moments productive? First, as money expenditure, this money enters into circulation. In other words, someone has to take an action and something happens, and I mean, it could happen automatically, but someone has to program it, right? In the second place, as this expenditure is of commodities which enter into the production process of value and surplus value, formally they pass as value to the product. Is this productive or not? The labor capacity of the working process will be transformed into capitalist productive force in the productive process of a mode of production. The wages as such, although they allow for the laborer a certain consumption in order to reproduce his labor capacity, are not directly productive. This is the whole question of the pay stub, as I have often referred to it. Productive should not be understood as the material technical process to manufacture a product, but the process of positing surplus value. The capitalist process or mode of production or valorization process. All the names, productive force, productive process, mode of production, not as the totality of capitalism or abstract capital, and wage labor, productive force, process, production, and wage labor are names of categories and determinations of capital, intra-totalized categories founded in capital. While categories such as living labor, by contrast, indicate the everlasting presence of the exteriority of capital. To confuse them, unify them means to lose the sense given by Marx into exteriority. I might note that when Jason Moore is talking to Adnan, he's talking more about the exteriority. Anyway, and such is the case of much of the later Marxist tradition. All categories are frequently totalized, even those required for the construction of the really existing socialism. Living labor was still a critical moment of exteriority regarding the productive forces. Does this make any sense? In socialist countries, which still subsumed living labor and historical concrete real determination, which, while limiting it, alienated it in some way, even if not a capitalist way. The money of the capitalist buys labor as a commodity. That's the first moment, right? The first line in our diagram. The money of the capitalist buys labor as a commodity first moment. Later, he uses it, it consumes it, and only at this moment there is a relation of production or productive of surplus value. Only in this way does the labor capacity, right? Remember we talked about capacity, right? Labor capacity become a productive force. So this is that moment where labor power, becomes labor power. Living labor, quote, living labor, presence of the exteriority in the totality, thus becomes a means whereby objectified labor is preserved and increased. To the extent that the worker creates wealth, living labor becomes a power of capital. Similarly, all development of the productive forces of labor is development of, in fact, the productive forces of capital. This is that moment, right? The subsumptive moment, close quote. As the productive force of capital and paid by means of wages, living labor, always really transcendental, becomes wage labor. This is that moment, right? Where, what is your own time becomes the boss's time as a necessary social form of labor for capitalist production. Wage labor indicates that living labor has been alienated as a totalized determination of capital thanks to the expenditure of a portion of money to purchase labor, that is, purchasing the labor capacity, right? So there's an exchange going on. Wages, or the portion of the money capital devoted to purchasing labor, is thus a necessary condition for the formation of capital, and it remains the constant necessary prerequisite for capitalist production. Presupposition of the valorization of capital, but also presupposition for the reproduction of the laborer's life. Capital, namely not labor, nicht Arbeit, destroys all the laborer's possibilities of subsistence outside the use of his wages to buy in the small circulation, the everyday means of subsistence. In other words, this constrains your ability to do certain things because you've obviously given up the time to go to work. Wages as such, however, are not productive. because they're not directly involved in the production process. They are what you get, not what, they're not engaged in this thing. It's the pay stub again, right? Furthermore, Marx gets to consider the fact that the component of value in the total value, the Gesamtwert of the product associated with the necessary labor time, is also associated with the wages that only pay the price of the labor capacity. Marx emphasizes twice living labor capacity in order to highlight the exteriority. In other words, there's a sense of what you do at work and what you do elsewhere, right? There is that other world, right? Anyway, back to the text. There are still two other components to the value of product. One, the costs of the means of production, and a third mysterious component beyond the original expenditures of money, a surplus value, which is described in the next chapter, chapter 2. We have seen the way in which money becomes capital. Money is only objectified past labor. As such, even if it buys and sells infinite times, it cannot create new value. Now, I know that sounds kind of abstract, but it really is only because when commodities are engaged that actually new value is actually being occurred. Otherwise, money just sort of floats around, sits in the money bins, does something else, sits in banks, whatever. Only when money denies itself and is exchanged with the commodity, that is, in this case, living labor, only when it manages to intra-totalize the living exteriority of the labor, only when it pays for his or her labor capacity with the means of subsistence required to reproduce the life of the labor, only then does money become or make the passage, the Übergang, into capital as such. This wouldn't happen with robots, right? Robots don't go home and have robot families and stuff, right? That's kind of why Amazon wants to go to, there aren't very many people around, just robots. Mere labor capacity is transformed into productive force, which is alienated actuality in the totality of capital, the exteriority of living labor. Living labor, the absolute not capital, becomes a founded being that is presupposing capital in capital's being, already given value, that is wage labor. I know that's a little complicated, but hang in there. Now, the oracle of the manuscript of 1844 can be understood. That is, the man of labor, now living labor, daily transforms his whole nothingness, living labor as not capital, nothingness, into absolute nothingness, into wage labor, not a dignified human being, but as an instrumental thing. Now, I know that's a long way to go, but, it is that issue of the not living labor, that is the robot, doesn't have any of these transformations going on. I mean, you could give it a kind of sentience, I suppose, but the moment it does get that, it would suddenly, it turns into the world of the Transformers or Terminator. I'm sorry, the Terminator. Anyway, what did Lukács, Kosik, and Althusser think about this very radical subject? It's not possible for Latin America, which has often represented the non-being, the non-human, the barbaric, even philosophically for many Europeans and Americans, to say something new. Is exteriority not a far more significant category than has previously been thought? In other words, if you're going to blow up people in boats, there really are people on those damn boats. I mean, anyway. So we're at the end. See, it didn't take too long to get there. I added a section in here on retail systems, more specifically to explain, at least to me, what cost price is. So I'll go through a little bit of this, but I will give it up in a moment and indicate where we're going to head on other days next week, besides doing Dussel. So we're going to do Dussel for a little bit longer, maybe continuing on maybe every week. And I don't know when it gets to the end eventually, but we will. And so let me do a little bit of this and then maybe skip forward to one of the other things that I'm going to do next week, which is kind of in opposition to Jason Moore, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. There's a new article that just came out in July by Kohei Saito, he of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, whatever, which Jason Moore, I think, subscribes to. So that's not a big problem. The real problem is kind of what that all means. But at least, Saito has made the Anthropocene kind of a more common word in Japan anyway. Anyway, in retail systems, the cost price represents the specific value that represents unit price purchased. This value is used as a key factor in determining profitability, and in some stock market theories, it is used in establishing the value of stock holding. Cost prices appear in several forms, such as actual cost, last cost, average cost, and net realizable value. Now you can see where accounting came in and made the question of cost price as a simple matter much more complicated. Cost price. Cost price is also known as CP. Cost price is the original price of an item. The cost is the total outlay required to produce a product or carry out a service. Remember that it's not making widgets necessarily. It's doing DoorDash or whatever. Cost price is used in establishing profitability in the following ways: selling price, excluding tax, less cost results in the profit in money terms. Profit slash selling price, excluding tax, when expressed as a percentage, produces gross profit or GP percent. Expense or net sales yields a percentage that, when used as the target margin, will produce gross profit. Now, then there's actual or landed cost. In calculating actual or landed cost, all expenses incurred in acquiring an item are added to the cost of items in order to establish what the goods actually cost. Additions also include, freight, insurance costs, import duties, yes, tariffs, and other charges which arise between manufacturer and retailer. And last cost, this is the actual value of the item when last purchased, normally expressed in units. Now, note, of course, that there are other matters that come in, that change your costs as a consumer. Namely, if you buy the damn thing like a car, it loses value once you step off the lot. Average cost. When new stock is combined with old stock, the new price often overstates the value of stockholding. The better method is to combine the total value of investment in stock, old and new, and divide by the total number of units to calculate the average cost. This is a very accurate method of establishing stock holding. Now, then there's moving average cost. The moving average cost is a slight permutation of the above, with the average being calculated from the previous average and new price. Net realizable value, which gets us to the last little thing in our category here, the net realizable value normally indicates the average value of an item in the marketplace. Often this cost is interchangeable with replacement costs. And note, when you try and do this in terms of returning something, there's a fee that, you have to, a reshelving fee, for example. Those are other kinds of examples of that. Now, let's see if we can get to, I don't even know if we're going to get there. Let's see. Let's try anyway. Because I'll read from the beginning of this for a few moments, hopefully to whet your appetite. All righty. This is a new article: Rentier Capitalism, Techno-Fascism, and the Destruction of the Common, Kohei Saito and Ryuji Sasaki. And is really new and really is useful because it critiques people like, Yanis Varoufakis, on techno-feudalism. So anyway, we'll get there. And I'll probably repeat this anyway when we begin this again anew next week. It's a short article. Well, it's not that short an article. It's an article. Let's put it that way. And we'll read some of this next week because I'm trying to do a review of this little article for something else. So anyway, this paper critically examines, this is the abstract, This paper critically examines the emerging discourse on techno-feudalism. While mainstream narratives celebrate technological advancement driven by American tech giants, proponents of the techno-feudalism thesis argue that a new ruling class named cloudalists because they represent the cloud as territory as well as property, landed property, has supplanted traditional capitalists, extracting data and rent in ways reminiscent of feudal relations. Because, yeah, they do. However, this discourse fails to account for the ongoing dynamism of capitalist investment and competition. In contrast, this paper advances the concept, and this is not a new concept. This is, Michael Hudson talks about this. Marx talks about this, actually, going all the way back. Rentier capitalism, which I think is really kind of the new deal that people need to sort of figure out. Rentier capitalism by revisiting Marx's analysis in Capital, with particular attention to his often overlooked theory of ground rent. And I note that that's what I've been yammering about for weeks now, right? The ground rent problem, and focusing on different ways in which Marx approaches the ground rent problem. A bunch of other folks have been looking at ground rent because ground rent still exists. For example, the Saudis own a lot more property than you think. They own the ground on which a lot of major buildings sit. For example, in Manhattan, for example. My favorite example from the 80s is the Saudis own the ground that the former AT&T buildings sit on. Anyway, which also says some other things about other matters. But anyway, overlooked theory of ground rent in volume 3 of Capital, drawing on Marx's notebooks, published for the first time in the MIGA, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. The paper argues that rentier capitalism constitutes the most advanced and contradictory form of contemporary capitalism, which accelerates the destruction of the common. Unless you think that's not important, this is happening everywhere, right? Accelerates the destruction of the common and undermines the conditions necessary for working class solidarity, as the dual crisis of capital accumulation and anti-systemic movements, intensifies socioeconomic and political instability. The threat of an authoritarian turn towards techno-fascism becomes increasingly imminent. And unless you think that's not important, that's what Doge is doing, right? Doge is serving in controlling the national data, your info, the database. It is authoritarian terms. So if you need a tool to address this kind of thing that we're currently in the middle of, and I don't know if we're going to escape it, that's an interesting question, but whatever. You might think about your kids anyway in that context. All right, the text itself. The keywords: Marx, rent, digital platform. There's a discussion here that's very important and very useful of the platform economy, the digital platform economy, which is a whole thing that I haven't gotten into here, but we've got to do that at some moment. And this is a way to begin talking about that in a much more serious kind of way about platform economy, because there's at least a decade of platform economy things going on. Alrighty, introduction. A specter is haunting the world, the specter of feudalism. The statement may sound odd given the prevailing optimism surrounding digital technologies. Indeed, mainstream discourses continue to celebrate the future of capitalism, driven by full automation, artificial intelligence, remember that, and biotechnology. All those are there right now. Yet a gloomier vision, is increasingly taking hold. In the context of prolonged stagnation in high-income capitalist economies, that's where we are right now. High inflation, right? And and some have already said, and in fact, the 22 of the United States of America, 22 of the states are in a kind of stagnation, or at least approaching recession. And this is problematic and is going to get worse before it gets better, because we still have orange maniac in charge. High-income capitalist economies and rising economic inequality. Some critics now bluntly contend that capitalism is already dead. Well, McKinsey work, I don't know. But anyway, I don't know what she wants. According to this perspective, however, it is not the workers of the world who have dismantled capitalism, but capital itself, which is what Marx talks about, right? In this narrative, capitalism is superseded by a revived form of capitalism, so-called techno-feudalism. Tech oligarchs, now referred to as cloudalists, are portrayed as the new ruling class of the digital platform economy, extracting data and rent from all of us. Note Varoufakis 2023. The concept of techno-feudalism is certainly provocative, but the specter of feudalism haunting the digital age is a curious amalgamation of reality and metaphor, which is kind of what we live on, right? Even more thanks to the Orange Maniac. Assert that capitalism has been killed, Varoufakis 2023, and some even claim that this isn't just a metaphor. Yet these same commentators frequently concede that their usages of feudal technology are indeed analogous, or that it reflects only an emergent tendency. You see, everyone's hedging their bets. In truth, it is difficult to deny that the global economy remains fundamentally capitalist. Well, that may or may not be true, but the mode of production still is capitalist. I mean, it'd be nice if there were real socialism out there, but it really isn't. We don't have a pervasive socialism. So capitalism is still there, fundamentally. As such, the concept of techno-feudalism quickly reveals itself to be ambivalent and analytically limited in its capacity to explain the dynamics of the contemporary digital economy. To move beyond the conceptual confusion surrounding techno-feudalism, it is useful to return to Marx's Capital. Oh, do we have to? Notably absent from the most techno-feudalist critiques is a serious engagement with Volume 3, as we have been doing, Volume 3 of Capital, particularly its theory of rent, which is why I've been doing rent for now, I don't know how many years. With few exceptions, scholars have largely overlooked the relevance of this aspect of Marx's work to the analysis of today's digital economy. It's only because Marx really kept on kicking rent as a concept far down the road, and then some people have chosen to sort of ignore it, mainly because it is so far down the road or diffuse or not fully, worked out. And that's kind of how you can explain, I think, Heinrich. Anyway, back to the text. This theoretical omission has contributed to the tendency to equate contemporary rent extraction directly with feudalism, bypassing a critical assessment of rent within capitalism itself. In other words, Marxists need to address the rent-seeking problem in an even more critical way, even though nobody who does that is going to get a Nobel Prize like people like Gary Becker did. Anyway, or Buchanan. In this context, the publication of Marx's economic manuscripts and notebooks in the MIGA, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, is highly significant. These texts illuminate the late Marxist theoretical developments in rent theory, yes, and offer a crucial foundation for analyzing rentier capitalism. By extending Marx's framework, this paper argues that rentier capitalism represents the most advanced and possibly final form of capitalism, like we all hoped. Marx's theory of rent reveals the destructive tendencies of this system, particularly through its monopolization. Remember, monopoly capital is still there, and predation of the commons, unless you think that's unimportant. That's what's going on right now. This is all really right there. Now, of course, this is not to suggest that Marx anticipated the current situation in its entirety, 19th century. A crucial problem that Marx did not foresee is the profound crisis facing contemporary anti-systemic movements, like the eco-socialist movement or the environmental movement. rentier capitalism bolstered by new technologies of surveillance, yes, the database, Doge database, and behavioral manipulation increasingly establishes a total subsumption of, remember that word again, right? A total subsumption of life under capital, thereby eroding the possibility of anti-capitalist solidarity. We're all too busy fighting about stuff, and not that it's trivial. It's just that sometimes, you just have to go step beyond that. It's not about voting at some moment. It can't be. I mean, it needs it. Of course, it's necessary, but there's other stuff got to be done. In the absence of powerful anti-systemic movements, no absence, even though, we had all that stuff on Saturday, right? With no kings. One can hope only that it becomes a complete anti-systemic movement. It's not quite there. Anyway, back to the text. Social, economic, and political instability is likely to intensify in the years ahead. That's the first 9 months, right? Potentially culminating in a shift towards a more authoritarian regime, you think? So, why the techno-feudal thesis misses the point? Reflecting on the decline of left-wing movements, I'm going to end in a second. So, well, maybe I should end here. Anyway, hopefully I've whetted your appetite to read this article, and which we will cover in tedious, I would assert, tedious detail next week. This is the stuff. To me, this is like where the current state of theory is. Varoufakis has really been important to me since he wrote his game theory book. But Varoufakis is just the guy. He's tied up with the problems of democracy within the context of the EU. Even though he likes commenting on the U.S. among many other things, and he's certainly anti-Soviet or anti-Russian in that particular context. So it's sort of interesting in all that context. So yes, we're going to look at this. No, there's no math as far as I can tell, and Saito is a philosopher by training. So we're not going to give very many equations. So, those who hoped for math are kind of going to be disappointed. So anyway, I'm going to stop here because in 15 minutes, come on, in 15 minutes, we got to talk to, listen to Adnan. I hope that people will engage or at least sign into Adnan's office hours and give them a thumbs up so that they're more, the algorithm gets poked or whatever. And I hope that you'll listen to Jason Moore, even though, yes, as I've said, there's critiques of Jason Moore's work are very moderately, out there. And I think the problem is, to put it in a nutshell, is that he's still, most of his objects of critique tend to be ones where he accuses people of dualism. And I'm not sure that he's being quite accurate. Let's just be fair. That I think he tends. There's several articles where he says, "Well, the problem with these folks is they're talking like Kantians." Well, as I think you could see in our little yammering about Kant, Hegel, and Marx of the last couple of weeks, that you can't. That if you just accuse someone of being a Kantian, that's just not going to work because a Marx going in that direction. You got to take all of it in it's just sort of a denunciation that might not be quite as useful. Anyway, so I am now, yes, going to stop. I'm going to go back to the meeting. And yes, that lunatic.